Hello, guys and girls, and welcome to today's lesson. As you can see here on the screen, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is commas. This is actually our second lesson over commas. Last Monday, we did our first mini lesson, and we were focusing on the use of commas in sentences that contain coordinating conjunctions. We're going to be adding a little bit to that today, but before we dive in and get started, you need to make sure that you have a couple of things. Number one, you should have a note-taking sheet. On your note-taking sheet, there are several blanks, and in those blanks, you're going to be filling in the things that are highlighted in yellow in today's presentation. So if you see something highlighted in yellow, it is important and needs to be added to your note-taking sheet. And the other thing you're going to want to make sure you have is a pencil. Obviously, you're taking some notes today, so you need to make sure you have a sharpened pencil ready to go. So once you have those two things, your note-taking sheet and your pencil, you can go ahead and move on and get started with today's notes. Like I said, last week we talked about using commas in sentences with coordinating conjunctions. This week we're going to be focusing on using commas in sentences that include dates. We have 4 rules that we're going to go over today. We're going to move through them pretty quickly. We're going to do a few practice questions, and that's going to be it. This is a mini lesson, so this is not going to take up too much of your time. Let's jump in with rule number 1. Rule number 1 says that when you are writing out a date in a sentence and you are writing the date in the month, day, year format, you want to use a comma to separate the day from the year. And here's an example. On July 4th, 1776, the United States declared its independence. So when I'm talking about month, day, year format, this is exactly what I mean. This date has the month first, July. It has the day, which is the 4th, and it has the year, 1776. Rule number 1 says when we write a date in this way in a sentence, we need to make sure we have a comma between the day and between the year. Now, before we move on to rule number 2, I do want to point out here that it is super important as you are copying these notes, especially the examples, to make sure you are copying the punctuation exactly like you see it on the screen. So on your note-taking sheet for the example for this one, right now, double check and make sure you have a comma after the 4 and you have a comma after 1776. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and move on to rule number 2. Rule number 2 for using commas in sentences that include dates tells us that if you are only using the month and the year in the sentence, you actually don't have to add a comma. So for example, the album was released in November 2022. So in this sentence, we have the month, November. We have the year 2022, but we don't have the day separating those two things. So in situations like this, since we don't have the day, you actually don't have to add a comma. Please make sure that you have exactly what you see highlighted in yellow copied on your notes, and once you've done that, you can move on to rule number 3. Rule number 3 tells us that if we are referring to a specific event in history, so if we're talking about some type of historical event, then we need to use a comma between the year and the rest of the sentence. So for example, in 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. Obviously, pretty big historical event, first person to walk on the moon. And so since we are citing the date, specifically the year that happened, 1969, rule number 3 says we have to separate that year from the rest of the sentence with the comma, like we see right here. This is another opportunity for me to remind you that it's super important as you are taking these notes to make sure you are including the punctuation in your notes. So double check right now, make sure you have a comma after 1969 on your note-taking sheet. And once you've confirmed that, you can move on to our final rule, rule number 4. All right, rule number 4, I told you guys we'd move through this pretty quickly today. It tells us that if we are referring to a date in a sentence, and that date is not at the end of the sentence, we need to make sure we have a comma before the year and after the year. So for example, the party is on Saturday, June 17th, 2023 at 6 p.m. If we look, this kind of reminds me of rule number 1 because we have a date where we have the month, the day, and the year. But rule number 4 tells us that if this date is not at the end of the sentence, we also need to add a comma after the year, right? So rule number 1 said, if we have month, day, year, we put a comma between the day and the year. And rule number 4 says if that date is not at the end of the sentence, we need a comma after the year as well. Please make sure that you have this copied exactly like you see it on the screen, including these commas on your note-taking sheet, and then you can move on to the practice questions. All right, on your note-taking sheet on the right-hand side, you have these 4 sentences. I'm going to be reading through these sentences, and as I read them, you're going to place the commas where you think they might belong in the sentences, but then you're also going to identify which one of our 4 rules that we just went over applies to that sentence. So we'll do the first one together. Sentence number 1 says, my birthday is December 5th, 2001. We need to add 1 comma to this sentence, and that comma is going to go after the 5 and before the 2001. So right now, I want everyone on your note-taking sheet to add a comma after 5th. And if we think back to rules 1, 2, 3, and 4, this actually is what rule number 1 told us. So I'm going to go back for just a second. You can look at your note-taking sheet. Rule number 1 said, when writing out a date in the month, day, year format, we need to use a comma to separate the day from the year. So this sentence does follow that. We have the month, December. We have the day, which is the 5th, and we have the year, which is 2001. And again, rule number 1 said, in this situation, we need a comma after the day and before the year. So on your note-taking sheet, you should have a comma after the 5th, and then you need to identify that that was rule number 1. Let's look at number 2. I'm not going to give you too much information about this one. I'm just going to read it, and then as I read, you are going to mark where you think the commas belong. And then you're going to tell me which of the rules you had to follow to figure that out. Simone will be out of the office until October 2nd, 2024 at 4 p.m. Go ahead and place the comma or commas where you think they belong in that sentence, and then identify the rule you had to follow to figure that out. I am going to go ahead and read sentence number 3, but if you're not done with number 2 yet, feel free to pause the video and finish that up before you move on. Our vacation in July 2025 will be our family's first time traveling to another country. Go ahead and place commas where you think they belong, and then identify the rule that you had to follow to figure that out. All right, again, I'm going to go ahead and move on to number 4, but if you're not done with number 3, please pause the video, put the commas where you think they belong, identify the rule before moving on. Number 4 says, in 1961, the Beatles released their debut album. Place the commas where you think they belong in number 4, identify your rule, and then in just a second, we're going to check our answers. All right, we are going to go ahead and move on to check, but if you're not finished with number 4 or any of these sentences, I really want you to pause the video, make your changes, guys. If you just go on and listen to me explaining it without trying it yourself, you're really not doing yourself any favors. I want you thinking, using that big old brain of yours, and then if you make a mistake, it's okay. You can correct the mistake as we check the answers here in just a second. All right, last but not least, we are going to go over the correct answers to our practice questions. We already did the first one together. We decided that we needed a comma after the 5 and before 2001, and we identified that that was rule number 1. Number 2 actually needed 2 commas. Simone will be out of the office until October 2nd, 2024 at 4 p.m. This sentence is written in month, day, year format. So rule number 1 told us that we need a comma after the 2. But then rule number 4 said if we have a date in a sentence and the date is not at the end of the sentence, we also need a comma after the date, after the year, right? So October 2nd, comma, 2024, comma, that is rule number 4. Number 3, our vacation in July 2025 will be our family's first time traveling to another country. Number 3 actually did not need any commas because all we have is the month and the year. Rule number 2 told us that if we have month and year only, we don't need any commas. Number 4, in 1961, the Beatles released their debut album. If we follow rule number 3 for this one, this was a pretty big historical event. Rule number 3 says if we're talking about a specific event in history, then we separate the year from the rest of the sentence with a comma. So you should have a comma after 1961, and you should have identified that as rule number 3. All right, that is it for our notes for today. Make sure that you have everything copied like you see here on the screen for the practice questions, and then you are done with your notes.